The planet Valethar Prime had once been beautiful. That was what the older soldiers said. They talked about the wide green fields that used to stretch from the eastern mountains all the way to the Silver Sea. They talked about the tall crystal towers in the capital city, how they caught the morning light and threw colors across the streets below. They talked about these things the way people talk about something they know they will never see again. Now the fields were ash. The towers were broken stumps. The streets were full of smoke and the sound of distant explosions that never seemed to stop. The war had been going on for 2 years, 2 years of losing. The Galactic Coalition had been at peace for 400 years before the Krath came. The Coalition was made up of 7 different alien species, each one older and more advanced than most civilizations in the known galaxy. They had fast ships, powerful weapons, and some of the greatest military minds any world had ever produced. For 4 centuries, nothing had threatened them seriously enough to test all of that strength at once. The Krath tested it, and the Coalition was failing. The Krath Dominion was not like any enemy the Coalition had ever faced. They were not a nation or a government. They were a hive. Every single Krath soldier, every drone, every ship crew was connected to a central mind, a massive thinking network that controlled them all at once. There was no fear in the Krath because fear is a personal thing and the Krath had no individuals. There was no hesitation, no panic, no confusion. When one drone died, the hive simply noted it and moved on. When 1,000 drones died, the hive calculated the loss and adjusted its plan without emotion. They were, in every way that could be measured, perfect soldiers. And they were winning. The Coalition had lost 9 major battles in the past 14 months. They had lost 3 entire star systems. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from 5 different species had died, and still the Krath kept coming, steady and unstoppable, like a tide that never got tired. It was on a cold morning on Valethar Prime that General Orethsen finally said the thing that everyone had been thinking, but no one had dared to speak out loud. Orethsen was a Sorathi. His species was tall and thin, with 4 long arms and pale silver skin. The Sorathi were known across the galaxy for one thing above all else, their minds. They were logical in a way that other species could barely understand. They could run calculations in their heads that would take a computer several seconds to complete. They did not guess. They did not hope. They worked only with facts, and the facts on this morning were very clear. He stood in front of the Coalition's War Council, a group of high commanders and ambassadors from all 7 member species, and he laid out the numbers. His voice was calm and flat, the way a Sorathi voice always was. He showed them the rate at which the Krath were producing new soldiers versus the rate at which the Coalition was destroying them. He showed them how long the supply lines could hold, and how long the remaining defensive positions could survive under current attack patterns. Then he said it. This war cannot be won. The council chamber went very quiet. He explained further. It was not a matter of courage or strategy, he said. It was mathematics. The Krath hive could replace losses faster than the Coalition could cause them. Every battle, even the ones the Coalition technically won, cost more than it was worth. The enemy was not just strong, it was endless. And the Coalition, no matter how hard it fought, was slowly running out of everything. Several ambassadors began talking at once. Some were angry, some were frightened. One of the older commanders from the Dravathi species put his head in his hands and said nothing at all. Ambassador Sarathvel sat quietly in his seat and listened to all of it. He was a diplomat, not a soldier, and he had spent the past 2 years watching soldiers die for ground that kept getting taken back. He was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. But even now, in this room full of brilliant and experienced minds, all agreeing that the situation was hopeless, something in him was not ready to give up. He waited until the noise died down. Then he spoke. "There is one option we have not tried," he said. The room looked at him. "There is a species," he said carefully, "on a small planet in the outer reaches. They are not Coalition members. We have observed them for some time but never formally approached them for military partnership. They were considered, he paused, choosing his words, not ready. Orath Sen turned his long pale head toward the ambassador. You are speaking of the humans. Yes. A short silence followed. Then one of the other commanders made a low sound that, in his species, was the equivalent of a quiet laugh, not a happy one. The humans, said Commander Thex of the Velhari, a broad, blue-skinned species who had been fighting wars since before most civilizations had writing. They have been a space-faring species for less than 200 years. Their ships are slow by our standards. Their lifespan is short. Their population, though growing, is still small compared to the great powers of the Coalition. They have never fought a war on this scale. No, Sarathvel agreed, they have not. Then what makes you think they could help where 7 advanced civilizations have failed? Sarathvel was quiet for a moment. He had spent a long time reading reports about humans. He had studied their history, their long, bloody, complicated history, full of wars and disasters and collapses and rebuildings. He had read about how many times human civilization had come to the edge of destruction, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, had not fallen. He was not sure he could explain it in a way that would make sense to the council. The humans were not the strongest, the smartest, or the most advanced species he had ever encountered. But there was something in their history that he could not find in the history of any other species he had studied. Something that he had no precise word for in his own language. I do not know if they can help, he said honestly. I only know that we have tried everything we understand, and it has not been enough. Perhaps what we need now is something we do not understand. The council debated for 3 more hours. In the end, it was not hope that made them agree. It was the absence of anything better. Late that night, a signal was prepared and sent across the deep black of space, aimed at a small blue-green world orbiting a yellow star. It was a request for help, formal, desperate, and not entirely sure it would be answered. On Vaelthar Prime, the explosions continued through the night. The Coalition soldiers held their lines and waited and tried not to think about what the general had said that morning. The war could not be won. That was what the numbers said. But the numbers had not yet met the humans. Nobody on the Coalition's command deck was expecting much. That was the honest truth. When Ambassador Sarathvel had proposed sending the distress signal to the humans, most of the council had agreed simply because there was nothing left to argue about. It was not hope that had driven the decision. It was exhaustion. They had tried everything that made sense. The humans were what was left when sense ran out. So when the long-range scanners above Vaelthar Prime picked up incoming ships dropping out of hyperspace on the edge of the system, the officers on watch noted it calmly, reported it up the chain, and waited to see what a token gesture of support from a young species looked like. What they saw made the calmness stop very quickly. It was not a small fleet. It was not a symbolic force of a few hundred ships sent to show goodwill. What came through the jump points was an armada, hundreds upon hundreds of vessels pouring into the system in wave after wave, filling the scanners with contacts until the display screens looked like someone had thrown a handful of sand at them. But it was not just the number of ships that made the Coalition officers go quiet. It was what the ships looked like. They were strange. They were wrong in ways that were hard to immediately explain. Coalition warships were built to precise and elegant standards, clean lines, balanced proportions, every section of a vessel designed with careful attention to how it fit with every other section. They were, in many ways, beautiful in their efficiency. Human ships were none of those things. They were big and loud and asymmetrical. Some had sections that looked like they had been added on after the original ship was built, extra plating welded on at odd angles. New weapon systems bolted to hulls that had clearly not been designed to carry them. Their heat signatures were enormous by Coalition safety regulations, A ship running that hot would have been grounded until the engineers fixed the problem. The human ships seemed completely unbothered by this. They ran hot and loud and rough, and they came in fast, and somehow all of it held together. Sarathvel stood at the observation window and looked out at them for a long time without speaking. Beside him, Commander Thex crossed two of his thick blue arms and uncrossed them again, a habit he had when he was thinking about something he did not know how to say. "They actually came," Thex said finally. It was not quite a compliment and not quite a complaint. It was simply surprise. A communication request came through from the lead human vessel, a ship called the Unbroken Asterisk, which Sarathvel thought was a very human kind of name for a warship. The face that appeared on the screen was a woman. She looked to be somewhere in her 50s, with short gray-streaked hair and the kind of face that had clearly spent a lot of time in difficult weather and difficult situations. Her left arm, Sarathvel noticed, was mechanical from the elbow down, a cybernetic replacement, functional and undecorated, with no attempt made to make it look like a natural limb. She introduced herself as General Mara Voss, commanding officer of the Terran Expeditionary Force. Sarathvel introduced himself and began the formal briefing. He explained the state of the war. He showed her the maps where the Krath lines were, where the Coalition's remaining defenses sat, where the critical positions were that could not be allowed to fall. He explained the Krath's hive mind structure, their regeneration rates, their attack patterns. He was thorough and precise, the way a good diplomat always is, and he watched her face as he spoke, looking for the reaction that the information usually produced. Most commanders, when they received this briefing for the first time, went through a visible process. First disbelief, then the careful controlled expression of someone trying to look calm while adjusting to something much worse than they had expected. Voss listened to all of it without any visible reaction at all. She did not flinch at the casualty numbers. She did not react to the maps. She just listened, her eyes steady and attentive until he was finished. Then she asked one question. "How long can your people hold the surface if we buy you time in orbit?" Sarathvel glanced at Orathsen, who was standing off to the side. The Sorathi general calculated for a moment, his eyes moving in the particular way they did when he was running numbers, and then he said, "Statistically, no amount of time changes the outcome. The fundamental problem is not one of time. It is one of mathematics." Voss looked at him. "Give me a number," she said, "not a philosophy." Orathsen paused. In his long career, no one had ever spoken to him quite like that. 60 days, he said, perhaps 70 under ideal conditions. "Good," Voss said simply. "Then we start now." She closed the channel before anyone could respond. For a moment, the command deck was very still. Then the human fleet moved. They did not form up in the clean, organized assault patterns that coalition warships used. They went in hard and fast and loud, breaking into smaller groups that seemed to operate almost independently, each one attacking from a different angle, communicating with each other in a way that was too fast and too chaotic for the coalition's tactical systems to follow properly. The Krath advance fleet, which had been methodically pressing its attack on the orbital defense grid, suddenly had threats coming from 6 directions at once. The battle was immediate and brutal. The Krath hit the human ships with the same overwhelming firepower they had used to break coalition fleets for 2 years, and the human ships took it. They were damaged, some badly, but they kept firing and kept moving and kept pushing into the Krath lines in ways that the Hive's predictive systems clearly had not anticipated, because the Krath began to shift and adjust, which was something the coalition had not been able to force them to do in months. Down on the surface, coalition soldiers crouched in their positions and watched the battle in the sky above them. The flashes of weapons fire lit up the night. There was more noise up there than they had heard in weeks. "Who is that?" asked a young Dravathi soldier looking up. "Humans," said the older soldier beside her. She had heard the word before, A young species, primitive, not worth serious consideration. Are they going to help? She asked. The older soldier watched a human destroyer take a direct hit, lose part of its hull, and keep going. I think, he said slowly, they are already helping. On the Coalition command deck, Sarathvel watched the engagement and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not yet confidence, not yet hope, just the first small, careful loosening of the certainty that everything was going to fall apart. He pulled up the file he had on human history and opened it again. He had read it before, but now he started reading it differently, looking not at the dates and events but at the patterns underneath them. The things that kept happening over and over across the long, complicated story of this species. The way they kept getting knocked down. The way they kept getting back up. He looked out at the battle in orbit, at those strange, too hot, badly proportioned ships that somehow kept flying when they should have stopped. And he thought about a word he had encountered many times in human history, but had never fully understood. He was starting to understand it now. The first week was chaos. Not the bad kind, or at least, not entirely. It was the kind of chaos that comes when something completely new enters a situation and refuses to behave the way anyone expects. The Coalition commanders had fought wars in organized, structured ways for centuries. There were protocols for everything. There were rules about engagement distances, about acceptable unit loss thresholds, about when to advance and when to pull back. These rules had been built over generations of experience, and they were treated, rightly, as wisdom. The humans seemed to have never heard of most of them. Coalition tactical officers watching the human units operate in the field sent back reports that were, in many cases, more confused than informative. Human squads would push into positions that the tactical models said were not worth taking. They would hold ground that the mathematics said should be abandoned. They would take heavy losses, fall back a short distance, reorganize in the middle of enemy fire, and come back at the same position from a different angle. It was not elegant. It was not clean, but it kept working in ways that the models did not predict. General Orathsen, who prided himself on understanding patterns, began spending long hours studying the human engagement reports. He was looking for the logic underneath the apparent disorder, the systematic principle that was guiding their decisions. He was certain there had to be one. Every effective military force operated on principles. You simply had to find them. After 4 days, he went to Sarathvel and admitted with visible difficulty that he could not find a single unifying principle. They do not follow a fixed doctrine, he said. Every unit seems to be making its own decisions in the moment. It should not work. And yet, said Sarathvel. And yet, Orathsen agreed quietly. What the Sarathi general had identified without fully realizing, it was something that coalition military science had no real name for. Human soldiers did not just follow orders and execute plans. They thought while they fought. Every engagement was also, for them, a lesson. They watched what the enemy did, and before the engagement was even finished, they were already changing how they responded. A craft tactic that worked in the first hour of a battle would often stop working in the third hour, not because command had issued new instructions, but because the soldiers on the ground had noticed it and adapted on their own. The Krath hive mind was incredibly fast, but it was fast at executing a plan, not at building a new one, and the humans kept forcing it to build new plans. 10 days into the engagement, a coalition medic named Sovalin was assigned to work alongside a human infantry unit for field coordination purposes. She was a Velhari, blue-skinned and broad, a species that was physically tough by most standards. She had been in the war for 18 months and considered herself experienced. The first day with the human unit adjusted that opinion significantly. She watched a soldier named Corporal Danny Reeves take a piece of shrapnel to the upper arm during a Krath push, sit down behind a broken wall, pull the shrapnel out himself with a tool from his belt, wrap the wound tightly with bandage from his kit, and stand back up to keep firing. The whole process took less than 2 minutes. He did not call for a medic. He did not ask for relief from the line. When Sovalin moved toward him to help, he waved her off and pointed toward another soldier who was in worse shape. She filed a report about it that evening. In her species, a wound of that severity triggered mandatory medical removal from active duty. The psychological shock alone was considered enough to compromise combat effectiveness. She wrote, asterisk, the human soldier did not appear to experience the wound as an interruption. He appeared to experience it as an inconvenience. This was not an isolated case. She saw it again and again in the days that followed. Human soldiers had a relationship with pain that she could not understand from a medical standpoint. They did not ignore pain. She could see clearly that they felt it. But they did not let it make decisions for them. They felt it, noted it, and kept going. It was as if, somewhere in their development as a species, they had learned to put pain in a separate room inside themselves and lock the door during a fight. What affected Sovalin more deeply, though, was something she observed on the 14th night. There had been a bad engagement that afternoon. A human platoon had held a ridge against a Krath assault for 6 hours and had lost nearly a third of its soldiers doing it. The ridge was held. The cost was high. That evening, Sovalin expected the surviving soldiers to be withdrawn for rest and psychological recovery, standard coalition protocol after significant losses. Instead, the soldiers built a small fire in the sheltered area behind their position. They sat around it. They said the names of the people they had lost. Some of them talked about those people, small stories, personal things, things that had nothing to do with the battle. One soldier cried quietly and nobody looked away or pretended not to notice. Another put an arm around him and said nothing, just stayed there. Then they slept. And in the morning, they were back on the line. Sovalin watched this and felt something that she later described in her personal notes as asterisk, a kind of respect so large it was almost frightening. She had seen coalition soldiers break under less. She had seen experienced warriors need weeks of recovery after losing squadmates. These humans grieved and then got up, as if grief was something the body needed to move through rather than be stopped by. Meanwhile, something was happening on the Krath side that had never happened before in the war. The hive mind was struggling. It had not been designed for this. The Krath's greatest military strength was its perfect predictive modeling, its ability to calculate what an enemy would do and position itself accordingly. Against every species it had faced, this had worked almost without failure. Coalition species were well-trained, disciplined, and consistent. Consistent enemies were easy to model. You learned their patterns and you exploited them, and they could not change fast enough to stop you. Humans were not consistent, not because they were disorganized, but because they made individual decisions constantly, and individual decisions at the scale of thousands of soldiers created a pattern that looked, to the hive mind's modeling systems, like noise. It could not separate signal from noise because, with humans, in a very real sense, the noise was the signal. A Krath biological commander, a rare and senior node in the hive responsible for making high-level strategic choices, issued an instruction that was without any precedent in the Dominion's history of warfare. It ordered its forces to specifically target human morale, to focus attacks on positions held by humans, to maximize human casualties in view of other human soldiers, to make the cost of resistance feel unbearable. This had worked on every other species the Krath had fought. It did not work on humans. The human soldiers saw their friends die, and it made them angrier, not weaker. It made them hold their positions harder. It made them push back with more intensity, not less. The very thing the Krath calculated would break them seemed instead to fuel them in ways the hive could not account for. The biological commander processed this result for a long time. Then it sent a message up through the hive network, a thing that the hive did not normally need to do because the hive normally knew what to do. The message was a question. It asked, "What are these creatures made of?" No answer came back. The hive did not know. In the Coalition Command Center, Orath Sen stood at his display screens late at night and looked at the data from the past 2 weeks. Then he looked at it again. The numbers were changing. Slowly, unevenly, in ways that were hard to be certain about yet, but changing. For the first time since he had stood in front of the War Council and declared the war unwinnable, the Sorathi general was not entirely sure he had been right. He did not say this out loud. He was a scientist and he needed more data before he would say anything at all. But he stayed at the screens for a long time that night, watching, and the expression on his long, pale face was one that people who knew him well had not seen there in over a year. It was attention, real attention, the kind a mind gives to something it has realized it does not fully understand yet. The war was not won. It was nowhere near won. But it was, for the first time, something other than lost. General Mara Voss called the meeting at 3 in the morning. That alone told the coalition commanders something about the woman. She did not call meetings at 3 in the morning because she had forgotten what time it was. She called them at 3 in the morning because she had been awake since the previous morning and had spent all of that time working. And when she finally had something worth saying, she said it immediately, regardless of the hour. Sarathvel arrived still straightening his uniform. Orath Sen arrived looking as he always did, precise and unreadable. Commander Thex arrived looking irritated, which was his default expression and did not mean very much. Several other senior coalition officers filled the rest of the seats around the long table in the briefing room aboard the Asterisk Unbroken. Voss was already standing at the front. Behind her, a large display showed a map of the Krath fleet formation, a dense and enormous cluster of vessels that sat at the center of the enemy's orbital presence like a dark heart. One section of the formation was marked in red. The Krath command vessel, Voss said, without any opening remarks. She pointed to the red section. Right there. Everything the hive does in this system runs through that ship. It is the central relay for all hive mind communications in this battle zone. Every order, every tactical adjustment, every signal that keeps those drones coordinated passes through it. She paused and looked around the room. If we destroy it, she said, the forward fleet loses coordination, not permanently. The hive will reroute eventually, but the window it gives us, even a few hours of a disorganized Krath fleet, is enough to break their orbital line completely. After that, the ground assault loses its support from above, and your surface forces can push them back. Silence in the room. Then Orath Sen spoke. This has been considered before, he said carefully. The command vessel sits at the center of their formation. The surrounding fleet density makes any direct approach statistically unsurvivable. No ship that enters that corridor comes back out. Not a ship, Voss said. She changed the display. It now showed a different approach, not a broad fleet assault, but a single narrow path through the Krath formation, threading between the largest concentrations of enemy vessels. A strike team, small, fast insertion craft. Low signal profile. They go in deep, reach the command vessel's outer hull, breach it, and destroy the relay core from the inside. Another silence. This one was longer. Thex leaned forward. The survival probability of such a mission is very low, Voss said. She did not dress it up or soften it. I know what the numbers are. Then you know we cannot ask soldiers to. I did not ask, Voss said. I informed my people of the mission and what it required. I made the odds completely clear to every individual. Then I asked for volunteers. She clicked to the next screen. It showed a number. 4,312. Every person in the room looked at it. That is how many soldiers volunteered, Voss said. After I told them the odds, after I told them that most of them would not come back, 4,300 people put their names on that list, and I had to turn most of them away because the insertion craft can only carry so many. Sarathvel stared at the number for a long time. He tried to imagine explaining to 4,000 soldiers that their chance of survival was less than 1 in 50, and then having every single one of them say yes anyway. He could not fully imagine it. Orath Sen said nothing. He was looking at the number 2, and for once, he seemed to have no calculation to offer. The plan was approved before dawn. They had 6 days to prepare, because the craft's pattern showed a brief rotation in their command vessel's defensive screen every 7 days, a small window of reduced sensor coverage that lasted less than 40 minutes. That was the only moment the insertion craft had any chance at all of getting through undetected. A young engineer named Priya Chandrasekharan had been working for the past 3 weeks on a device that could intercept and disrupt hive mind relay signals. She was 24 years old and had joined the expeditionary force straight out of university. She slept on average 4 hours a night and spent the rest of her time in the engineering bay talking to her equipment, the way some people talk to stubborn animals, firmly, but with a kind of affection underneath. She finished the device in 6 days. It was not elegant. It was held together in several places with manual fasteners and what appeared to be, to the coalition technician who inspected it, a piece of wire that had no business being in a piece of military hardware. The coalition technician wrote in his report that the device was structurally irregular and visually unconventional. Then he tested it, and it worked perfectly, and he did not know what to write after that. On the 7th day, the insertion craft launched. There were 44 of them, small, dark, and fast, running minimal power to keep their signatures low. They carried 216 soldiers in total, the ones Voss had selected from the volunteers. Every one of them knew what they were flying into. They had been briefed on every contingency, every fallback option, every emergency protocol. Most of those protocols, everyone understood, would never be used. You do not need emergency protocols if you do not survive long enough for an emergency. Among the 216 was a young soldier named Kale Tors. He was 19 years old, from a small coastal town that most people had never heard of. He had been in the military for 14 months. He was not the strongest or the fastest or the most experienced person on his insertion craft. He was, by most measurable standards, ordinary, the kind of soldier who did not stand out in briefings, who carried his weight and did his job and did not ask for recognition. He had volunteered because, as he explained to the soldier sitting next to him during the long, quiet flight through enemy space, it seemed like the right thing to do. The soldier next to him, a woman named Sergeant Ellis who had been fighting for 6 years, looked at him for a moment and then nodded once. That was enough. The insertion went badly from the start. 3 of the 44 craft were detected and destroyed before they reached the outer hull of the command vessel. The remaining craft breached the hull at 7 different points, and the fighting inside was immediate and brutal. The craft interior defenders were dense and fast, and the corridors were narrow, which eliminated most of the human advantages and made everything close and personal and very loud. They lost people at every junction, at every door, at every turn of every corridor that led deeper into the ship. The 216 became 180, then 140, then fewer, the numbers dropping in the way that numbers do in close quarters fighting when everything is happening too fast to stop and count. Kale Tors lost the 3 people he had come in with inside the first 20 minutes. He kept moving because stopping was not an option, and because the relay corps was still ahead, and because that was the mission, and the mission was the reason all those people had come here. He reached the relay corps chamber with 11 others. By the time they had fought through the chamber's defenders, there were 4 of them left, and the remote trigger for Chandrasekharan's device had been hit by weapons fire and was no longer working. 4 people, no remote trigger, the relay corps humming in front of them, enormous and loud, the center of everything the hive was doing in this system. One of the 4 looked at Kale. He was the youngest person in the room by several years. He looked back at them, and then he looked at the device in his hands, and then he looked at the core. He told the other three to get out. He used a tone of voice that was very calm and very certain, the kind of tone that does not leave room for argument. The other three looked at each other. Then they went. What happened in that chamber in the next 90 seconds was not witnessed by anyone who survived to describe it in detail. What was witnessed? By every coalition officer watching the sensor feeds, by every soldier on the surface looking up, by General Voss standing on the bridge of the Asterisk unbroken with her mechanical hand gripping the edge of the console, was what happened after. The command vessel went dark. Not damaged, not reduced, dark, silent, a dead thing floating in space. And then, like a wave moving outward from a stone dropped in still water, the Krath fleet went quiet. Ships stopped firing. Drones drifted. The coordinated, perfect, unstoppable machine of the Krath Dominion's forward fleet became, in the space of a few seconds, a collection of confused parts that no longer knew what to do. On the Coalition bridge, nobody spoke for a long moment. Then slowly, something began at the back of the room. A Dravathi officer started it, a low, deep sound that his species made in moments of overwhelming feeling. It was picked up by a Velhari officer beside him. Then another. Then a human ensign near the front let out a sound that was entirely different in quality but identical in meaning. General Orathsen stood very still at his station. He looked at the dark shape of the Krath command vessel on the screen. He looked at the drifting, uncoordinated enemy fleet beginning to fall into disarray. He looked at the numbers updating on his display, the probabilities shifting in ways that his models had not shown in 2 years. Then the Sorathi general, a species that bowed only at the death of someone truly great, turned toward the empty air in the direction of the command vessel, and he bowed. He held it for a long time. Outside, the Krath fleet began, slowly and for the first time in this entire war, to retreat. The retreat of the Krath fleet was not fast. Nothing about the Krath was ever fast in the way that a panicked army is fast, stumbling over itself, breaking apart, running in every direction. Even without their hive coordination, even with their command vessel destroyed and their forward fleet drifting in pieces of its former order, the Krath pulled back in the slow, heavy way that a tide pulls back. Steadily, without emotion, without chaos. But they pulled back, and that, after 2 years of watching them only ever move forward, was everything. The coalition surface forces pressed the advantage the moment the orbital pressure lifted. The Krath ground units, cut off from the fleet above and receiving no updated instructions from a hive mind that was scrambling to reroute through secondary channels, fell into patterns that were rigid and predictable in a way they had never been before. The coalition soldiers, fighting alongside human units who showed no sign of slowing down despite weeks of continuous engagement, pushed forward and kept pushing. By the end of the 3rd day, after the command vessel's destruction, the Krath had abandoned Veilthar Prime entirely. The planet was not healed. It would not be healed for a long time. The fields were still ash and the towers were still broken and the streets still smelled of smoke and old fire. But the explosions had stopped. For the first time in over a year, the sky above Veilthar Prime was quiet. People stood outside and looked up at it. Some of them did not know what to do with the silence at first. They had lived with the noise for so long that the absence of it felt strange, like a pressure that had been there so long you had stopped noticing it until it was suddenly gone. Then slowly, they started to understand that it was over. And the sound that replaced the explosions was very different. General Mara Voss did not celebrate. She had never been a person who celebrated while there were still things to do, and there were still a great many things to do. The surviving insertion team soldiers needed to be recovered. The dead needed to be accounted for. The fleet needed repair assessments. Supply lines needed to be reestablished. She moved through all of it with the same steady efficiency she brought to everything, checking items off a list that only she could fully see, talking to her officers in the short, direct way she always talked to them. Sarathvel watched her work and thought about how she was, in many ways exactly what humans always seem to be, most visible in the middle of things, most alive when there was something that needed doing. The quiet aftermath, the ceremony and reflection that other species moved toward naturally after a great event, seemed to fit her less comfortably than the work itself. He approached her on the fourth day, when the immediate demands had settled enough for conversation. "The Coalition Council wishes to formally acknowledge what your people have done," he said. "There will be a ceremony. You will receive the highest honor the Coalition can give to a military commander." She looked at him. "The names of the insertion team," she said, "all of them. I want them read aloud at the ceremony. Every single name in full, not summarized, not a number on a screen, names." "That is 201 people," Sarathvel said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He nodded slowly. "It will be done." She went back to her list. The ceremony was held 2 weeks later in the largest hall that the Coalition's temporary command installation could provide. Every senior officer and ambassador of every Coalition species attended. The human expeditionary force was represented by Voss and a small group of officers who stood quietly in their worn uniforms and looked slightly uncomfortable with the formality of the occasion. Ambassador Sarathvel gave a speech. He spoke about what the Coalition had faced and what it had believed about itself, and about the nature of the war in those dark months before the humans arrived. He did not soften it. He said plainly that they had given up, that the best minds the Coalition had produced had looked at the situation and decided it was finished. He said this not as a confession of weakness, but as context, because without understanding how completely hopeless it had seemed, you could not understand what the humans had actually done. Then the names began. A reader stood at the front of the hall and read them one by one. 201 names, human names, from places most of the Coalition species present had never heard of and could not pronounce. The hall was very quiet. It took a long time. Nobody left. Nobody looked at their devices or leaned over to whisper to the person next to them. They sat and they listened to every name as it was called, and the calling of each one was an acknowledgement that a specific and particular person had existed, had made a choice, and was gone. When the last name was read, Voss stood and received the Coalition's highest military honor, a small, simple thing that nonetheless carried the weight of 400 years of history, and she held it in her mechanical hand and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she thanked them, briefly, plainly, in the way she did everything. Back on Earth, there were no grand parades. There were small things. Towns held quiet ceremonies in parks and squares. Schools held moments of silence. Families lit candles in windows for people who were not coming home. The news covered the victory, of course, and there were speeches and official statements and all the formal things that governments do when something large has happened. But the deeper response was quieter than that. It moved through communities the way important things often do, not in announcements but in conversations, in the things people said to each other in ordinary places, in the stories that parents began telling their children, not as grand, heroic tales but as true ones, with all the weight and cost that true ones carry. A generation grew up hearing about Kale Tors, about Sergeant Ellis, about Priya Chandrasekaran and her device held together with wire, about General Voss standing on the bridge in the dark, waiting. They heard about 4,000 volunteers who raised their hands after being told the odds. They heard about soldiers who grieved at night and returned to the line at dawn. They grew up understanding, in the particular way that children understand things that are shown to them rather than explained, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when the situation required it, not because they were fearless, not because they did not feel the weight of what they were doing, but because they felt it fully and did it anyway. In the years that followed, Coalition military academies added a new course of study. It was, officially, a course on human combat psychology and tactical methodology. In practice, It was something harder to define, an attempt to understand and document something that resisted documentation by its very nature. The course materials grew over time until the primary text ran over 900 pages, covering everything from human pain tolerance to battlefield adaptation to the social rituals soldiers used to process loss. The conclusion of that text, written by a panel of the coalition's most respected military scholars after years of research, was surprisingly short. It said, "No model sufficiently captures it. It must be witnessed." Sarathvel's own report, which he completed 6 months after the battle, became required reading at every coalition war academy within a decade. He had written it carefully, trying to be precise in the way a good diplomat and observer always tries to be precise, documenting what he had seen without overstating it. The report covered many things: tactical observations, biological notes, cultural analysis. The line that was quoted most often, the one that ended up on the wall of the Academy's main entrance in the original language Sarathvel had written it in, was near the end. It said, "Humans do not fight because they believe they will win. They fight because they cannot accept not trying. This distinction is, apparently, the most dangerous force in the known galaxy." General Orethsen retired from the coalition military 3 years after the battle. In his retirement address, a rare thing for a Sorathi, who typically left positions without ceremony, he spoke for a long time about how the war had changed his understanding of what was and was not possible. He said that he had spent his entire career trusting mathematics above all else, and that he still believed in mathematics. But he had learned, he said, that there were variables which did not appear in equations, things that could not be measured in advance and therefore could not be predicted. He did not give these things a name. He said only that he had watched them operate, and that he would not make the mistake of leaving them out of his calculations again. Far in the future, decades after the battle, in a time when the Krath Dominion had changed and the galaxy had changed with it, a young Krath scholar sat in a university classroom on a world that had once been a battlefield. She was studying the history of the war, specifically the Battle of Vaelthar Prime, specifically the moment the command vessel went dark. She had read every analysis. She had studied the tactical records and the engineering reports and the casualty numbers. But she kept coming back to a question that none of the analyses quite answered. She raised it with her professor after class, an old academic who had spent his career studying the history of the war from both sides. "What is the human word," she asked, "for the thing that made them fight like that, the thing that the hive could not model, the variable that your Professor Orethsen said could not be measured? What did the humans call it?" Her professor was quiet for a moment. He had been asked versions of this question many times over the years, and he had given several different answers depending on who was asking and what he thought they were really trying to understand. This time he thought about Kale Tors in a chamber at the center of a Krath warship, 19 years old and completely alone, looking at a device in his hands. He thought about 4,000 people raising their hands. He thought about soldiers around a small fire saying the names of the people they had lost, and then going to sleep and waking up and going back to the line. He thought about what holds a person together when the numbers say there is no reason to keep going. "They have many words for it," he said. "They always have. They are a species that has always had more words for the things that keep them going than for the things that stop them." He looked out the window at the sky. "But the one they use most often," he said, "is simple. Hope." The scholar wrote it down. She looked at it for a moment, one small word, and then she looked up at the sky the same way her professor was looking at it, at the wide and quiet space above them that had once been full of fire and was now full of nothing but light. Outside, the world was ordinary and peaceful, and full of people going about their days, none of them thinking about the war, none of them thinking about the cost of the sky being the way it was. That was perhaps the whole point.